Hello and welcome to this live stream on font design, except it's not actually live. I did this recording this morning and broadcast it, I should say, this morning. And I was asked by a couple of people if the video would be available afterwards. Unfortunately, I didn't press the button that I needed to make sure that I could actually download the video and put it up on YouTube. So I'm recreating it here and it's good practice, isn't it? So it gives me a chance to go through the subject matter again. The subject, of course, is font design and actually giving you an opportunity to create your own font, which could be based on your own handwriting or on someone else's. And I'll go into a bit more detail as we go on. But what I wanted to do was to start by talking about the anatomy of a font, what a font actually has in it. And really one of the most important things to think about is how the font is laid out. So I've got a keynote that I've prepared for this just to show through some different things. And if we go over to the keynote now, you'll see it just up here to my left. You can see that we're going to be doing this using Procreate on the iPad and something called Calligraphr. Now, Calligraphr is an online tool, and you don't need to worry too much about it at the moment because I will walk you through the steps of how we upload to that service. It's free and it's really fantastic to be able to upload and create a font in either TrueType font or an open type font, which you can then download onto your iPad or onto your PC or Mac and actually use that font as you would any other font. So let me get started with this keynote, and I'm going to start by just explaining that when we have a font that we're looking to create, the first thing that we're going to start with is guidelines. And the guidelines will allow us to lay out our font. In this case, you can see that we've got a baseline, and the baseline is where all of your letters sit. So a word sits along the baseline. And then the first part above the baseline is where letters like E, N, O, all of your lowercase letters sit into that space there. And I gave you a sneak peek just now, but if we bring that word back in, you can see how the whole word sits onto the baseline, and then we've got those smaller lowercase letters that sit within that first part, and that part is called the X height. So that is the X height of a font. Now above the X height you have the letters on here like the L and the D, other letters like T and H that extend beyond the X height, and that area there is called the ascender height. And if that's the ascender height, of course, the bit that goes below, like the tail on this F, like the tail on a G, a Y, and even some stylized Zs, will go down into that descender height. And that basically is the layout for a font. Now, when it comes to font design, there are various words that people use. You may have heard them before. You may be thinking, I don't know nothing about font design. But when I mention some of these words, you may well think, oh, I've heard of that. And maybe you did know what it was, maybe you didn't. So let's have a look at some terminology. Now, the first one that I'm going to introduce you to are the terms serif and sans serif. And you may well have heard them with regard to fonts. You'll often hear that people will say, oh, I'm using a sans serif font or a serif font. If I put some words in those fonts up here, so serif in this case is written in a serif font and sans serif is written in sans serif fonts, you may spot what the difference is. If it's not that obvious, let me just help you. It's all about the way that the letters end, the terminal ends of letters. In a serif font, you have serifs, or sometimes called flourishes, but it's the way the end of a letter will have a piece on it. Times New Roman is a serif font, and each of the letters, the bar, for example, across the top of a capital T, then has two little down bars at the end of it. Sans serif, on the other hand, The sans is from Old French and it means without. So sans serif is simply without serif, without flourishes. And you can see on these particular letters here that the ends of the letters are, let me just go back to that because that's skipped forward for me. But you'll see in just a moment that the ends of the letters are very square where they end. So that's how you can tell the difference between a serif and a sans serif font. And when it comes to designing your own, you can decide what you want your font to be. It's always worth thinking before you create a font, what's the purpose of my font? If it's something that needs to be read, so a long passage for example, it's really important to make sure it's very readable, and sans serif can often achieve that for you. That's why the type standard often is with a sans serif font such as Arial, because they say that sans serif fonts are easier to read, and certainly people with dyslexia they will often prefer something that is a plainer font. So bear that in mind. So if you're creating a font that you want to be able to use for a body of text, think about keeping it fairly standard and not too many extra flourishes on it. But of course you may be creating a font for a heading or for something stylistic. Maybe it's to go on your website and you have a particular style that you want to achieve, and then you can of course make sure your font follows your branding style. So the next term that I want to mention is kerning. Now, kerning is actually the careful calibration of the space between two letters. So I've got two letters twice here, A, W, and what you can actually see is the one on the left has kerning and the one on the right has no kerning. So that careful calibration, and it is actually, it's a design feature where you want to draw your letters together and allow them to overlap without touching. By having that kerning there, you use less space and it is a better way to lay out your font. If you have no kerning, what you end up with is a font where every character has its own space, and it can make your font look quite spacey. So bear that in mind as you go on. Tracking. Now I talked about kerning and how kerning is that careful calibration between two letters. Tracking affects the spacing between a whole line of letters. So the whole sentence is impacted by the tracking. So give you an example of that. In this, we have this sentence has standard tracking. Now, if you increase or expand the tracking, what you actually end up with is a sentence that stretches longer. And this can be quite useful if you're trying to fill out a particular space, maybe to get some extra space in a heading and that type of thing. Similarly, you may be restricted on your space, and in that case you can reduce the tracking and use less space. But not too much, because otherwise letters can actually overlap and that can make it difficult then to read. The next term, and I'd love to hear how you're saying this word when you read it on the screen, because many people will read that as leading. It is in fact leading. And leading, the reason it's leading is because it comes from the way that print setters used to use pieces of lead to space out the blocks of text in their print, the actual prints that were used to then press down in a printing press. And by adding extra lead, you can increase the gap between those lines, and by reducing the lead or the leading, you will bring those lines of text closer together. So that's leading, and I can give you an example of that. This paragraph here has standard leading, but if you were to increase the leading, you can see exactly the same piece of text now uses more space, and indeed you can reduce the leading and bring those lines closer together, again being careful that they don't overlap, because that can affect the readability of it. Now this type of thing is often used in print setting when laying out, for example, a page in a magazine, and you've got a body of text down one side and you want to have a paragraph that is referencing that but is separate from it, so you don't want people to read across the lines. And by increasing or reducing the leading, you can actually make that stand out on its own, and it can then be something that people's eyes are drawn to read first before getting onto the body of the text. So all useful things that you can use when laying out your font subsequently. But we'll carry on now. Now, I talked about how with the anatomy of a font, it will sit on a guideline on this as it sits on the baseline. Well, there are actually words that font designers use so that they can have a look at the different elements of a font to see how they work. One of the words that gets used is this one, hand gloves. There are others. Another one is Hamburg fonts with a T at the end, TS, or Hamburg fonts is another one without the T. And it's a way that a font designer can have a look at the way the different letters interact with each other and sit along that guide. It gives me an opportunity to talk about some of the elements of a font so that you have a greater understanding of some of the terminology. I'll start off with, on the H there, you can see it has a bar. That's also present on a capital A. You also have, of course, a bar on F and T and things like that. And depending on the style of the font, depends on whether it is a full line across, or in the case of some stylized T's, you may have something that's angled, and so on and so forth. So it's very much up to you, but in that case, when it crosses across the H like that, that is the bar. We then have the bold, and the bold there, any closed in letter that has that gap in the middle, so a C, the A here, the D, the O, they have a bowl, and that is just the term that it's used. So if somebody says it has quite a large bowl or a narrow bowl, that's the part that they'd be talking about. On the N, we can see that that part of a letter is called the stem. Interestingly, on the other side of the N, where it curves over, that's actually referred to as the shoulder. And you can see why it is shaped just like that. Moving along this word, we can see that we have a link. Now, the link in this case links two parts of this letter. It links the top part that sits within the X height to the loop at the bottom. And I should probably have said that that next bit is the loop, but I'll come on to it in a moment. The G here also has an ear, and that is a stylized flick, sometimes off the end of a letter. It can also be used to connect two letters. So that's the ear, and I mentioned it before, there's the loop on the letter G. Now, the next two things you're aware of from what I said before. You can see where the letters, in this case on the L, extend beyond the X height. That's the ascender, and you're not surprised to know that the loop on the G is a descender. It descends below the baseline, in this case below the X height. Moving along then, just two more. We've got the spine there on the S, and the last term you'll be familiar with because I talked about it quite a lot. You can see we've got serifs, and there are serifs on the other letters as well back through there. If you look at the top of the D and the top of the L, and indeed the H, the upper and lower ends of that. So serifs are those flourishes that you can see. So we are going to be using Calligraphr. Now you don't need to head over to the website just yet. That comes in part 2 of this presentation, because I need you to create some content so that we can actually upload it to Calligraphr. So what we're going to be doing today is actually using Calligraphr with the iPad. Now I'm using an iPad 10.5 Pro. This will work on any iPad that supports Apple Pencil, and I've created the templates in a Procreate file to make it easy for you so that you can get creating and get on with it. So I think what we need to do now is head over to the iPad, and I've got my iPad set up so that I can share this with you. Now I've actually created this this template file, which you can download from the Facebook page. I'll also see if I can put a link in the YouTube description so that you can find that. And additionally, I've got a camera on my iPad so that as I'm doing things on the screen here, you can see what's happening, and that may just help a bit just to see what's going on. Okay, so making sure that I keep my iPad in shot. I've got downloaded already the A4 template that I created, and if I just touch on that, we can see that that loads onto my iPad. And what I'm going to do first of all is just mention this template, because you will see that there are squares in the corners, these squares here, and there's also a QR code just here. Now what these are what the website that we'll be use to align your font. So don't remove them and don't write over them, because they're important for making sure that your font will all align when we get to that part of our presentation. So and I know that you're going to want to be able to get a font out at the end of this, so please do follow along with that after you've created your font. So with regard to this template, let me show you what I've done on this. If I'm not going to go deeply into how to use Procreate because I imagine you know, but I will mention a couple of things along the way. The first thing is that over in the top right hand corner, you'll see there is a black circle. It's black in my case. If you've got any other color, for example, if you've been using a different color, you'll see that it's now a different color. We need it to be black because font creation happens in mono. It happens in black in this case. And so if you're on the color disk, in this case, you can actually drag the middle section down to the bottom diagonal left, and that will give you black. If you're on the classic view, which is along the bottom there, if I go to classic, black is again right down in the bottom left hand corner. So once you've got the black selected, you don't have to worry anymore about that. The next button just to the left of the color dot is there's two squares, one on top of each other, and these are that's the layers palette. And if I just open up the layers palette, let me zoom in a little bit closer for you, just so that you can see what I'm talking about. Now, I've laid out the templates in this Procreate file to make it easy for you. You will see we've got a lowercase group, an uppercase group, a symbols group, and the top one I'll come on to in just a moment. We could actually turn that off for now. So if we go right the way down to the lowercase group and make sure that is the only one that is ticked at the end there, you'll see just next to the tick there is a disclosure arrow. If I tap on it, it will expand that group for me. And what you have within that group is where it says lowercase is a locked layer. I've locked it because you don't want to write on it, because that means you can come back and use this template again. So above it, I've created a blank layer, and the blank layer is the layer that you're going to be creating on. So everything you do happens on a see-through layer, if you like, above that lowercase template for the lowercase group. And if I just close that up and then come onto the uppercase and turn that one on, you'll see that it actually now replaces the template. If you look on the screen at the template, let me just make it a little bit bigger so that you can see what I'm talking about. So with uppercase off, we're on lowercase, and when I turn on the uppercase, it takes over because it's above it in the order of that layer stack. Open up that group, and you'll see that again we've got a locked template layer, the uppercase template, and we've got your uppercase, and it's your uppercase you'll be creating on. Always make sure that your layer is selected, as mine is here, when you're going to be creating in that particular group. Above that, I've done a symbols template, and if I turn it on, you'll see that the background changes again, and this time it's all kinds of different symbols. Now, on the free version of Calligraphr, you have a maximum number of characters that you can create. The maximum number for you on a free version is 75. Now, on the lowercase, uppercase numbers and the restricted punctuation that is included on those two sheets, that takes you to a total of 70 characters. So that means you can choose on this template layer 5 of these. Now, you're not going to choose, obviously, the numbers again, because you've already got those. So what I would say is, and I've given you a clue just in that the name of the layer, where I've called it symbols at hash ampersand pound oblique stroke, because those 5 are the 5 that I tend to create if I'm creating a free font. But feel free, if you're particularly partial to a square bracket, by all means go and create a square bracket. It's up to you. Just know you can only do 5 of those because that is your limit. Okay, now I'm going to turn off that symbols layer and just resize my canvas there for a moment. And what I want to talk about now is that guide info layer. Now, I created this. You're not going to have it turned on while you're creating on your other layers, but I created it so that you could understand how the guides within Calligraphr work. And if I turn it on and zoom in here now onto this letter here, you will see that the descender and the ascender sit either side of the X height. Now, what that means is, in the X height is where your lowercase a, e, I, o, u, n, x, and so on will sit. And then if you have a letter with a tail going up, it will sit within the X height and then extend into the ascender area. And if you have a letter that goes down, that will sit within the X height and then go into the descender area. Just to give you a quick idea, so because sometimes seeing it actually helps, if I just come into here, if I was writing, appreciate I'm on the capital, the uppercase template, but if I were on the lowercase template and I was writing a lowercase a, it would be within here like that. So that would be my A. Now, on Procreate, if you do something like that and you want to undo what you've just done, of course you can do a 2-finger tap and it will step back. That allows me to show you that if I was going to do the letter B, my letter B would sit like that, okay? My letter C like that, and so on. Now, if I've got, let me just do one more with an ascender. So my letter H would sit like that. If I'm doing something like a Y, my Y, that's a little bit too low. 2-finger tap just to undo that. My Y will sit within that descender area, as of course would my G. Okay, so you get an idea of where they sit. If you're doing capital letters, your capital letters are going to sit basically from the baseline at the bottom of the X height up to the top of the ascender height. So your letter A would sit like that, all right? And with that guide layer off, if I just open up and make sure that I'm sitting on the uppercase, I can actually come through and just show you, because you can decide what your letter is going to look like. You may decide it's a very traditional letter A that simply goes up and down and has a bar across, but you could decide, for example, that what you want to create is something that looks more spaceship-like, or indeed it could be more of a bubble text where it actually comes round. Whatever you like. keep going. If you were into your old English, then of course it may look something a little more traditional. But bear in mind what you're creating as you go. And bear in mind also that if you've completed a closed shape, as I have on the A here, you can actually drag the colour into that. So if I put my Apple Pencil onto the colour in the top right and drag it over, all the time I keep moving, the colour will stay with the Apple Pencil, and when I let go of it, it will actually drop into that space. So I could come in here, I might just do this bit by hand, but you'll see that you can create a stylized font if you like, and I'll explain a little bit more about that a bit later on. A couple of other things to bear in mind with Procreate. If the line you're creating needs to be nice and straight, you may be thinking, oh, I can never draw a straight line, it's always wobbly. Well, there is a trick, a nice little handy tool within Procreate that allows you to have a straight line. And if I just draw my line and then pause at the bottom of it, you'll see I've kept my Apple Pencil on the screen, it actually goes straight. Let me do that again for you. So, and let me do a long line sideways. So if I just come across here and then pause, it straightens the line for me, and you'll see I can actually move that line then. If I put another finger onto the screen, it actually locks it at 30 degree or 15 degree angles so that you can actually position it where you want. So use those tools. If it's a circle that you want, make sure that you know you can actually allow that to complete that circle for you as well. So lots that you can use within Procreate to get the best out of this. And just as something else, I just thought about this, something that you can also use, if I was creating, for example, a capital B, and I'm just going to fill that there, you'll see I'm just short of the top of the ascender line and a bit below the baseline there. What I can actually do is on the top row next to the arrow on the left, there's the ribbon select tool. If I select that and I have freehand selected at the bottom, I can draw around this shape. I can then touch the arrow on the top line and it gives me the ability to resize this. I can actually reshape it. Bear in mind that if it's on magnetic, it will snap to different places. So taking magnetic off allows me just to space it where I want. And I could, having created that, rather than doing all my letters as standard letters, I could use the eraser now, and if I choose the monoline tool again, I could actually come in here and say, what I'm going to do is erase and so each of my letters is erased out. So there's so much you can do in Procreate. There's so much you can do with these templates. There are some people, I was talking to someone recently who said that they needed a bullet point that was their company logo. And you could do that in this. If your company logo, for example, were, I don't know, let's just do something. Supposing your company logo, I don't know what this might represent. It doesn't matter. It literally is just to show you. If that were your company logo, you could create that, and then every time you press the letter C, that's what you'll get. And this is how they create those wingdings and webdings fonts that are all different little characters. You could do a whole font of smiley faces. You could do whatever you like. If you like drawing cars, draw a car in every box, and then every letter will represent that little sketch you've created. Have fun with it. and just be creative. So I am going to go back over, because there's a couple of other things I want to mention on the keynote, just to get you thinking creatively with regard to this. So if we go back over to the keynote, when I say you can do different things, you can of course just use your handwriting. And in this example that I've created in the keynote, this is a font which was just some standard letters I put together, and you can name your font at the end, but we'll do that in part 2. So you can have a font that's fairly standard like that, but you can actually get a bit more creative. This is a font that I call Polaroid, and Polaroid, they're Polaroids basically, I hope you noticed, but basically I created, I think, about 9 different Polaroids that I then angled in different ways. You'll see that they've got different bits of tape along the top. That's where the real variation is on those, and the shadows are slightly different, the way that they just seem to sit slightly off the page at the bottom on some of them and not on others. So you can do that, and that's erasing out in each of those letters as well. Or if you were creating a font for a title of something, you might do something like this. This is my font called Leaf It Out. And this is, you'll see every capital letter has the leaf pointing upwards, and every lowercase letter has the leaf pointing downwards. So again, it's just by creating some different leaves, flipping them over, angling them slightly differently, just to give some variation in the font. But because I've used the same leaves, or the same size leaves, it means that the font looks quite even when you actually look at it like that. The only difference to that, I did do my punctuation on uppercase, and for lowercase I created a slightly smaller leaf, so you can see the colon at the end of called is sized down a bit from the bigger size of Leaf It Out. So have a go and see how you get on. Be creative. Now, I did mention that it can be your handwriting, it can be someone else's handwriting. Now, one of the issues with that is actually how you capture your handwriting, because if you write in every single box, sometimes it ends up not looking like your handwriting. So what you can do is write out "the quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog" in capitals. Now, I say you. If you're capturing someone else's handwriting, then getting them to write that is a great thing to do. And I don't mean capturing it so you can pretend to be them. I'm thinking more with regard to children's handwriting. I think back to when my sons were younger, the first time when they first started to write, how wonderful it would be to capture their handwriting from that moment. You know, the fact that they maybe wrote the J the wrong way round or whatever, but you can actually get them to write out the sentence in capitals and then write it out in lowercase, and then you'll have every letter that you need. In actual fact, you'll have HRTU twice, E 3 times, O 4 times, and every other letter has one example of it. So have a look at that. It's also a great way of just seeing how letters change, because if you've got 2 H's, have a look in the font, in the writing, and see how the H looks different. In the case of the uppercase, the H on the first word and the at the end of the second line, the H is actually slightly different. That's not unusual, and I'll talk more about that in part 2 as well, because that's about variations in font. And we can, there's something certainly worth being aware of with regard to that as we come on. So I'm going to leave you now. We're just about 35 minutes in, so I'm going to leave you with a quote that's been attributed to Albert Einstein, and it's at this time, at the moment, of course, we're all locked down. This video is being created in April 2020, so it's an odd time to be about. It's a great time to use the time to be creative. But Albert Einstein said, "Creativity is contagious. Pass it on." So I think this bearing in mind what's going on in the world, this is a great opportunity just to use some of that time and energy to be creative, to learn something new, whether it's this or something else, but to actually get going with it. Now, if you don't have an iPad and you're thinking, oh, if only I had an iPad, I've got the templates that you can print out and then upload them to the website. So I'll put the links, if I can, either in the bottom of this YouTube clip, or I'll add them to my Facebook page and make sure that I link you over to that so that you can download those if you're using pen and paper but still want to join in. So that's it for now. I want to thank you for checking out this video. I'm sorry it's not the original video from the live broadcast this morning. It's just technology got the better of me. As I said this morning, 3 weeks ago, I'd never heard of recording software like this and Twitch TV, and I've had to learn those new skills so that I can actually put this out. But it's been fun. I've enjoyed it. Thank you for watching. And if you've got any questions, please do post them in the comments down below, and I'll do my best to get back to you. Remember, there is a part 2 to this where we actually look at taking what you've created, uploading it, and then downloading your very own font. So do make sure that you do your homework, which is to create a font in whatever style you like. Be creative, have fun. And for now, thank you very much for joining me. Take care and stay safe. Thank you.